So you're trying to raise, I guess, doubts over Trident, if that would actually work in a crisis. Because, well, basically, my question is, if you're worried about one submarine out there, your entire nuclear arsenal, and one submarine being taken out, wouldn't the solution to make that more reliable be more nuclear weapons and more submarines?
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually, that point has been made to me by a number of activists in Washington who've said, yes, I've heard this argument before. Now, where have I heard it? Oh yeah, from the Missileers, the ICBM people, because it's pretty much the only justification for keeping your ICBMs is the fact that the submarines might be detectable. There is no way on earth Britain could afford to put more out, certainly not 2 systems. So it's a pragmatic judgment on my part that the consequence is that we would then, if we took this argument seriously as a state, then do we instead invest in an alternative system like the F-35 and the B-61s, or do we make more submarines, which incidentally doesn't solve the problem, it just makes your adversary slightly more challenged. They have 2 targets rather than 1. But, you know, what cost? Because the problem is that the cost of creating a system that detects the submarines and then takes them out is probably, in 10, 20 years' time, significantly cheaper than producing the submarines. So if your answer is double the number of submarines, then the answer of your adversary is, well, okay, I'll just put a few more resources in and I can take both of them out. If your answer then is, well, let's put them on aircraft, that's great to me, not because I think aircraft is a better system, but that it creates a bigger question mark in the minds of the people, both in the decision makers, the real decision makers, and the public. Do we really want this system after all? Now, I'll just take this one step further, because it's my next, I haven't done this yet, but it's my next step, which is, okay, so I've talked about anti-submarine warfare. What about cyber? Because, and this is where Des Brown's focused on, because he's triggered a debate in Britain about cyber capabilities, and it's only just started. It's got legs. It's going to run, and this affects everybody across the world, which is if cyber capabilities develop the way they are going, then it logically makes sense that given that offensive cyber is much cheaper than defensive cyber, because if you're defending your systems in a cyber way, you have to anticipate all the different attacks on your system and then put brakes in. If you're an attacker, all you have to do is to invest in a few and know that at least 2 or 3 of them are getting through, and you may neutralize your opponent's nuclear weapon systems. So offensive cyber is cheaper than defensive cyber. Defensive cyber is cheaper than the nuclear weapon systems. You know, when you're talking about investing $1 trillion in nuclear weapon systems over the next 30 years, compare that with the offensive cyber costs, and then they're a fraction of that. So why would you not invest in offensive cyber to neutralize the systems your opponents have invested far more money in? And while you're at it, you can kind of think, well, my offensive cyber not only neutralizes my opponent's nuclear weapon systems, but I can also use it for strategic deterrence purposes, because I can plan to take out all these systems, you know, energy grid, food distribution systems. I can steal all my opponent's money. I can take down their financial systems. You know, you can have a massive impact with your offensive cyber capabilities. Question then becomes, why have nuclear weapon systems at all? Now, I'm not saying that that is the world we'll face in 20 or 30 years' time, but it may be. And that's what we need to be thinking about if we're serious about nuclear disarmament, global governance, about relationships between states, let's actually think outside the box, or start thinking about deterrence systems and how they're going to relate to emerging technologies, because we have no choice but to think about this.
You said earlier that Britain would never adopt an F-35 and B-61 gravity bomb system. Why?
Why? Okay, several reasons.
Should we not record this part for Toby's benefit?
Toby knows my opinions on this.
Just send him the clip.
Several reasons. One is because it doesn't feel like a very good system. I mean, it's just these things are emotional, right? Well, this is like taking a step back in time, as Agna was hinting at. We've been going back to a system. Now, this is not a logical thing, because the F-35 B-61-12 is a completely different animal to the Vulcan bombers that we were deploying in the 60s. But we made a decision back in the 60s, and we need to be loyal to those that made the decision, which is Britain needs the best, and if it costs, then it costs. One of the I talked earlier about the Trident. Did I talk about the Trident Commission?
Briefly. And
Very
F-35s just aren't good enough.
They're great. They're spending you're spending $1 trillion on them, right? They must be great.
Oh, yeah.
Most expensive weapon system ever invented.
As long as it's not raining too hard.
Yeah, indeed. But there's something about it looking like a cheap option that just doesn't cut the mustard in terms of this. Now, but that's not the most important reason. The most important reason is this is completely path dependent.
What do you mean by path dependent? I'm sorry.
We have already invested quite a bit of money in the successor class submarine. By 2020, we will have invested around 12 to 13 billion dollars. I refer to this as the Concorde fallacy, and that is because there were several points in the Concorde program where they looked at the program to review whether it was worth continuing. The concept of supersonic civil aircraft sounded good, but how much money was it really going to cost? Well, they did. They sunk quite a bit of money in the early years, and then they looked at it and they started to realise that the cost of this was going to be huge. But they'd sunk all that money in. So the official that was going to be making a decision, oh no, we tried it, but it's not going to work, would be the official that would be said, you wasted all that money. So rather than be accused of wasting that money, they carried on. And then they reviewed it again later on, and even more money down the toilet. And it's that same mentality. It's not about rational, logical calculations. Actually, nothing ever is. Yes, that comes into it, but you have to look at the psychology of it, the politics of it, the sociological dimension, and you have to see it in a systemic way.
What we call the trap of commitment.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are probably a whole load of other reasons as well. And there's a reason to my psychology as well, which I can't go into because somebody else would probably be able to do that much better than me.
I've got one if nobody else does. No?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I got more, but
yeah.
Well, why don't you can each ask a second one, and because I can ask Paul anytime. I mean, I guess you could too, because he has email, but I do.
Yeah, you kind of hinted at this earlier, that nuclear weapons are all about making Britain feel special and close to the United States. Wouldn't the solution to getting rid of, nuclear weapons in Britain would be to find some other way to make Britain feel closer to the United States? And do you have any ideas on what that might be?
Very good. Immunity to change. perfect. Britain already is in so many more important ways. You know, we share a number of multinational companies, you know, British, American and stuff. But the deeper question, I think, is what is the relationship for? Because that's a question that is not really asked on either side of the Atlantic. It's asked more on this side of the Atlantic because you're less dependent on the relationship than we are. But what's it for? And I think in the end we need to have that debate. That's the debate. I don't have answers to that. I do have my own answers to that, but I think it needs to be a process rather than me coming up with my answers. I mean, my answers are, it's about values, it's about freedom and democracy, etc. And actually, that's not a transatlantic thing. That's a global discussion. But that's my answer. But I would be much more interested in triggering a discussion about what is it that we value about a transatlantic relationship. And actually, now is a good time for us to be doing that because we're debating about Europe, what our relationship is with Europe. And it is interesting, if a bit depressing, to be in Britain at the moment, witnessing some of this stuff. You know, it's a bit similar to the presidential elections over here. Interesting and depressing. But there's forces at work here that are much bigger than the nuclear weapons debate, which I think we could channel in useful ways. And those of us working on nuclear weapons need to see this in a much broader context.
Yeah.
My question is...
Okay, we got it. Don't do this. Just jump in there. If you learn one thing, it's these people are all probably dumber than you are. So you should not defer to them or just go.
I just prefer to be courteous.
Yeah, forget that. Does no one any favors.
Yeah, well, I should know after a semester in his class. But
I'm quite abusive.
Tends to throw pens sometimes. My question is kind of about the different political parties in Britain. It sounds like you advise to stay away from having an anti-nuclear policy simply because it would keep you from being elected. And in that, the opinions are very polarized in that regard. But it also sounds like each party kind of is wishy-washy in terms of the steps that they take. The Labour Party took steps to seem anti-nuclear, but at the same time Disarmament tried to reduce the numbers, and then when the Conservative Party came in, they reduced it even more. Yep. And sounds like the Central Party's kind of has feet in both arenas. So would the initiatives maybe benefit from having a centralized effort, or kind of just not talk about it, but kind of do it on the side in terms of smaller steps?
So this is a very interesting question, and it's one that Jeffrey and I were talking about. And one of the conclusions that we came to is that actually this works better if it's not a hot political issue. In fact, the more people talk about it, the more entrenched they become, and the less likely there is to be any shift. So you could say that people like Jeffrey and I are on the side of evil here by creating an issue and talking about it. In fact, the less we talk about it, the better, possibly. That's not a comfortable conclusion to come to. So an easier conclusion is, how do we talk about it? And I think the way we talk about it is by highlighting the madness of the current way of doing it, and by then just asking questions that are bigger than the polarized "are you for or against?" So one of the things that I'm constantly asked on the back of reports that I produce, so what's your solution? And I resist giving any answers to that, which sounds like a cop-out, but what I'm trying to do is to avoid being labelled a for or against. Being recorded, whatever. I'm against. Everybody knows I'm against. but my point is that we need to transcend that polarized binary thing and to step out and look at it from above. When it comes to the strategies of political parties, I think it is much more constructive to have a political party or to have a political debate that is not should Britain get rid of its nuclear weapons or not, but how can Britain play a responsible role in reducing nuclear dangers worldwide? And that's the answer I give from BASIC officially. That's our mission. Our mission is to ask the question and to come up with processes that encourage other people to ask this question. How do we reduce nuclear dangers worldwide and move towards a world free of nuclear weapons? And the question about whether Britain gets rid of its nuclear weapons or not needs to be in that discussion rather than can we be purist and escape that and then sit under the American.
So what you're saying is unilateralist is counter-effective, counter.
As a unilateralist, I would say it's counterproductive. Exactly, no, because in the end, process matters.
No, of course.
And I've described to you as well as I can the reasons why it doesn't work electorally. Because there's a bigger issue here about the relationship between a leadership and their electorate. And the electorate are buying into the concept of democracy, which is actually about aggregating responsibility to these people who then make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And if they're going to do that, I need to be able to trust them as almost a parent-child relationship. And in a parent-child relationship, you don't want your parents kind of going, yeah, whatever, child abuser can come in here and whatever, you know? It's about being protected, you know? As I want my parents to protect me, and protection, and then you've already lost the argument. So, and this is a question that I'm struggling with constantly, which is, we are in the game of security. What does security mean? Well, it ought to mean something positive. It ought to mean something about being free of fear. But actually, we don't talk about security in that terms. We talk about security in terms of threat. And then when we start looking at the threats out there, it looks a very scary world. So security then becomes about hard security. It's not about freedom from fear, it's about being in fear. And then you've lost the argument. So I think process is crucial. The position political parties have needs to be strategic and realistic. And that means taking people on a journey. And it means avoiding the binary question, are you for or against nuclear weapons? It means we as a country have to ask the right questions, and we have to take the population with us. And that doesn't mean being so far out there, like Jeremy Corbyn, down that route, which even if he's right, and I reserve judgment on that in certain ways, even if he's right, is counterproductive, if that makes sense.
Yeah?
Which one?
Oh,
Yeah, no, you go for it.
okay. I mean, you're welcome to.
If whenever through disarmament the UK crosses the minimum deterrence threshold,
Yeah.
do you think they will be comfortable with getting and they getting to the US umbrella maybe?
Yeah.
Would they be willing to have US nuclear carrying facilities in UK land, or
Yeah.
would it be
Yeah.
different kind of?
I think that really deeply depends upon the path between now and the point that you describe. If the path is a path that is similar to what Jeremy Corbyn thinks, then they won't be prepared for that. But if the path is one about faith and confidence in NATO and the relationship with the United States, then I think there would be. Because there isn't a strong... you know, if the public today, if you took an opinion poll amongst the public today, I think you'd get about 80%, I don't know this, but I suspect, you'd get about 80% support for NATO, about 80% support for, 75-80% support for NATO as a nuclear alliance today. And if you look in the 1980s and the debate within the Labour Party then, which led to unilateralism, that was the biggest internal Labour Party discussion, was about the relationship with NATO. How can we, the question was put, how can we possibly get rid of nuclear weapons and then sit under the nuclear umbrella? That sounds like it's a cop-out, it's irresponsible, it's not fulfilling our part of the bargain. But if it were if it was sold as a case of Britain is in NATO, NATO is a nuclear alliance, we still have to rely on nuclear weapons, but we need to think in terms of being a reliable NATO partner, and what that means is an alliance where states contribute to the best of their ability from an alliance-wide perspective. There's a very rational, strong case for Britain getting rid of nuclear weapons and investing the money instead in special forces, in rapid reaction capabilities and non-military capabilities within NATO that we do have expertise in, but are being atrophied at the moment because of investing all this money in Trident, which is justified on the basis that we have to have an independent nuclear deterrent, which demonstrates a lack of faith in the alliance. You know, you can see where I'm going here. You know, nuclear weapons are, in essence, a last-ditch final thing. Now, last-ditch final things need to be seen as an alliance issue, not as an independent, separate state issue. And that's an argument that I often use within Britain and within the US for saying Britain getting rid of its nuclear weapons does not have to be anti-NATO. In fact, it can be the other way around. It can be pro-NATO. Yeah. But that argument, if it does take root, would mean Britain needs to be ready to host US nuclear weapons on its soil, if that is seen as an effective way of doing it. Now, it may not be an effective way of doing it, because nuclear weapons are strategic, they have global reach. You know, there's nothing that requires nuclear weapons to be physically in Europe or in East Asia for the nuclear deterrent to work. But if it was seen for political or other reasons, then it ought to be ready to host.
Having flashbacks to class.
Yeah.
Nate, you want to fire off one more?
Yeah, this is there a debate in Britain about anti-ballistic missile, about basically ballistic missile defense, and does that figure into the debate that we're talking about right now at all? Perhaps even as, like, you know, investing in missile defense as a replacement for and sinking a lot of money into offensive capabilities?
Right. There was the germ of a debate in the early 2000s. Absolutely none. There is not a whiff of it. Not a whiff. And there's been an interesting development within NATO as a whole, where, you know, NATO has bought into the ballistic missile defense concept, which incidentally from a NATO-wide perspective, it still doesn't really make sense, you know, because they're not investing any money in it.
Okay.
There's no significant money. So because there's no significant money from a NATO perspective, then there's no debate, because money and debate go hand in hand. And it's true, because that's what politics is. Politics is about the allocation of resources, and we're not allocating resources to missile defense. So the answer is a clear no, there is no debate. It'd be interesting if there were. I mean, BASIC was involved in the little germ of a debate back in the early 2000s. We don't do any work on missile defense. It just doesn't feature.
You got one more?
Yeah.
All right.
I think it's really curious that the UK relates a lot to the US, but I don't know what's the relationship with France as being the two nuclear weapon states in Europe, in the heartland of Europe. Is there any discourse, partnership relation, or even between NGOs that are looking for disarmament between those two countries?
Barely any, because it's very difficult to find anybody in France that is working. I mean, to be fair, there are a small number of people, but they are individuals, not movements or organisations. And there's a couple of high-profile people in France, and there's one or two anti-nuclear activists. But even if you look at some of the larger organisations like Greenpeace or whatever, they don't touch French nuclear weapons systems. There is a perception within France that there is a sort of national consensus, which on the surface of it looks as if that is impregnable. But the thing about national consensuses is that they're actually quite vulnerable. The problem for an anti-nuclear activist in Britain is that it's a really mature debate. Actually, it's deeply immature, but it's a mature debate in the sense that it's been around for a long time. So if you open your mouth and you start talking nuclear weapons, people are already framing it in terms of anti, pro, in terms of naive or responsible or whatever. In France, there isn't any awareness or debate. It's just you're French, you're pro-nuclear. But if you start to shake such a situation, it may go nowhere. But if it starts to gather pace, then there isn't the framing that people already have in the debate. So I'm probably unique on this planet for thinking that France, the French debate, there is potential there that hasn't been developed. But I'm not the person to develop it. For a start, I don't speak French, and I have no relationship with the French that gives me legitimacy in that debate. But I'm quite encouraged that there are one or two senior people, former defence ministers who were from the right, not from the left, who are starting to talk about France needing to reassess its commitment to nuclear deterrence. Paul Quiles and Michel Rocard is also involved, and there's one or two others. But they are literally a handful of individuals. You had a question.
I did have a question, but it might...
Fire away, Bob.
It's a bit more of a technical question, but...
That's fine. I can always say I have no idea.
Okay. You mentioned offensive cyber capabilities targeting energy, infrastructure, and financial systems.
God, we really are on the edge of my expertise. Okay, go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about what are the bigger threats to anti-submarine warfare technology?
The threats to anti-submarine warfare,
or
the threats that anti-submarine warfare technology have for submarines?
Right, because so far it seems like it's just acoustic detection.
Okay, so no, it's acoustic detection, active and passive, but mainly active is where a lot of the research is going. So what you have there is you have a source which would need to be low frequency at quite a significant weight. You'd probably put it on a manned or an unmanned large surface vehicle. But then you could have a fleet of very small very small underwater vehicles that could communicate if they're close enough to each other, or with unmanned vehicles in the air, which could then detect any significant sized object for thousands of miles. So that's the acoustic. Another is magnetic anomaly detection. So the Earth has magnetic core. You can have magnetic anomaly detectors, and there are some that are coming out at the moment based on the so-called squid technology that is mainly used in the civil sector in medical applications, where tiny shifts in the magnetic field can be detected by these small detectors. These have a range of 1 or 2 kilometers, and the range is getting bigger. Now, the big shift that is going on, and I'll talk about some of the other detectors in a second, but the big shift that's going on is not in the detections, It's not even in the platforms, although both of those are quite significant. It's in the computing power. So what this guy David Hamling talks about, the guy that was in Vienna last week, is he talks about the fact that, for example, the F-22 Raptor aircraft, which is your most sophisticated aircraft, based on 1990s computing technology, can make calculations roughly 9 million bits, 9 million calculations a second. Your iPhone 6 can make something in the region of 12 billion a second in your hand. Now, the reason for that is because in the civil sector you have the application of Moore's law, which is that every new generation has a significantly greater computing capacity at a fraction of the cost. And that's the way it goes. It just keeps going on that way. And it's applied for years and years. In the military sector, everything gets more expensive, you have fewer platforms, and they take longer to create, so that you get the F-35. $1 trillion, no idea when we're really going to see the first one properly flying in service, and it has all sorts of problems. So you've got the military sector going, and the military sector are waking up to this, and kind of going, well, why bother when all we need to do is take an iPhone and put some wings on it, and you've got an incredible platform, and you can invest in millions of these at a fraction of the cost, and the capability is so much greater. And you know, David's written this book called Swarm Troopers that opened my eyes to this. It was published late last year, and that's why I commissioned him to look at the underwater systems, and it's really taking off. And so you've got wake detection as another thing. So when a submarine is going along, it churns the water up. Even it doesn't matter how deep it is, it churns the water up, and this then creates a wake that can be detected at great distances. If you've got the computing power and the sensors to do that. There's all sorts of dimensions to this wake. There's the churning of the water. There's any emissions. There's heat. You know, water is just tiny bit warmer in the wake than it is elsewhere. If you've got enough computing capability and the right detection systems, you can pick that up. There's one or two others. I can't remember them off the top of my head. But you know, just go to the basic website. It's an 8-page briefing, and it has all of these technologies. It's